August 15, 1942, marked the start of one of the Pacific War's most perplexing mysteries. Commander Kurita stood on the bridge of his destroyer, watching the dark waters of Blackett Strait with growing contempt. Intelligence had warned him about the American patrol torpedo boats. Those plywood vessels the enemy called PT boats. As another squadron roared across the moonlit waves, engines screaming like wounded animals, Kurita allowed himself a thin smile. The Imperial Japanese Navy had faced battleships and carriers. These mosquito boats seemed hardly worth the ammunition. The PT boats had arrived in the Solomon Islands with bold promises. Built by Elko and Higgins in American shipyards, the 77-foot craft carried 4 torpedo tubes and bristled with machine guns. Their wooden hulls could slice through water at over 40 knots, making them theoretically ideal for hit-and-run attacks on the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery, coordinating PT operations from Tulagi, had watched dozens of these boats deploy with high expectations. The Navy's propaganda had already called them the cavalry of the seas. But Montgomery harbored private doubts that soon proved prophetic. The first major engagement came on the night of August 20, 1942, when 8 PT boats intercepted a Japanese convoy near Vella La Vella. Engines at full throttle, the boats charged like knights in a medieval joust. Torpedo after torpedo leaped from their tubes, leaving phosphorescent wakes across the black water. Crews held their breath as the weapons streaked toward hulking transports and destroyers. Then came the crushing Nothing happened. One torpedo passed directly beneath a transport's keel without detonating. Another struck a destroyer with a metallic clang, bounced off harmlessly, and sank into the depths. Commander Kurita received reports of the attack the following morning. According to records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, Japanese officers in the Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters actually laughed when they read the after-action reports. The Americans had fired 17 torpedoes in that single engagement. 0 hits, 0 damage. The PT boats retreated under heavy fire. Their heroic charge amounted to wasted ordnance and fuel. Kurita ordered his staff to compile reports from other encounters. The pattern was unmistakable and, from the Japanese perspective, darkly amusing. Lieutenant Robert Reed commanded PT-109, one of the boats in the Vella La Vella fiasco. His after-action report dripped with frustration, barely contained by military formality. The torpedoes had run true, the attacks executed by the book. Yet the Japanese ships sailed on, as if the PT boats didn't exist. Reed's crew had risked their lives charging into range of destroyers that could have torn them apart with a single salvo. For what? The humiliation of watching torpedoes malfunction, or miss, became a bitter joke among PT squadrons. They had gone into battle with wooden swords, expecting to wound giants, only to discover their weapons were toys. By September 3, 1942, urgency about the torpedo problem grew, though few in the Navy's upper echelons wanted to admit it. Captain James Fay, commander of submarines operating from Brisbane, had filed increasingly angry reports about torpedo failures since the war's opening days. His submarine skippers reported the same maddening pattern: torpedoes running too deep, failing to detonate on contact, or suffering premature explosions that warned targets without inflicting damage. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington dismissed these complaints with a bureaucratic arrogance that would later look criminally negligent. The Mark 13 torpedo, designed specifically for PT boats and aircraft, embodied what was wrong with pre-war American weapons development. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport had created a weapon based on peacetime assumptions and minimal testing. Its magnetic exploder, the Mark 6, was supposed to detonate beneath a ship's keel and break its back through hydrostatic pressure. In theory, this was devastatingly effective. In practice, the magnetic exploder was so sensitive to variations in Earth's magnetic field that it rarely worked as intended. The Pacific's magnetic environment differed significantly from the Atlantic waters where limited testing occurred. Lieutenant Howard Shorty Bowers experienced the torpedo problem's deadly consequences firsthand. On September 11, 1942, his PT-137 stalked a Japanese cruiser for over an hour, maneuvering into perfect attack position despite heavy seas. At 800 yards, point-blank range, for a torpedo attack, Bowers ordered fire. All 4 torpedoes leaped from their tubes. The first exploded prematurely just 200 yards from launch, nearly swamping the PT boat with its blast. The second's engine failed, sending it spiraling into the depths. The third porpoised, breaking the surface repeatedly before diving deep and passing far beneath the cruiser. Only the fourth ran true and struck the hull with a satisfying clang that brought cheers from Bowers's crew. The cheers died when nothing happened. The warhead failed to detonate. Searchlight snapped on, pinning PT-137 like a moth to a board. 5-inch guns thundered, hurling shells that threw up enormous waterspouts around the fleeing boat. Bowers swung the helm hard over engines screaming at maximum power, and somehow escaped into the darkness. 2 crewmen were wounded by fragments. The cruiser sailed on, probably unaware how close it had come to real danger. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, finally ordered a comprehensive investigation in October 1942. Findings, compiled by teams of engineers and combat officers, revealed a scandal reaching into the highest levels of naval procurement. The Mark 13 had never been adequately tested under combat conditions. Its magnetic exploder was fundamentally flawed, its depth mechanism unreliable, and its contact exploder, meant as a backup, was too fragile and often shattered on impact without triggering detonation. Essentially, the Navy had sent men into battle with weapons that didn't work, then blamed those men when the weapons failed. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued monitoring PT activity with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commanding Southeast Area Fleet Operations, noted in his diary that American torpedo boats had fired over 100 torpedoes with virtually nothing to show for it. His staff joked about the American fireworks displays that preceded each PT retreat. The psychological impact on American crews was devastating, eroding confidence in their weapons and mission at a time when the Pacific War's outcome remained uncertain. November 7, 1942, dawned gray and oppressive over Guadalcanal, where the ground campaign had devolved into a brutal stalemate. PT squadrons operating from Tulagi found themselves thrust into roles never envisioned by their designers. With torpedoes unreliable, commanders emphasized machine guns and small cannons. Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, who had evacuated General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines in PT-41, now lead attacks where PT boats served primarily as floating gun platforms, harassing Japanese supply convoys with automatic fire. The Tokyo Express, the sardonic, Allied nickname for Japanese high-speed reinforcement, runs down the slot, presented both opportunity and frustration. Japanese destroyers and fast cruisers would race south under cover of darkness, delivering troops and supplies to Guadalcanal before dawn, then retreat beyond the reach of American air power. These vessels moved at 35 knots or faster, making them extremely difficult targets even if torpedoes had worked properly. PT boats intercepted these runs, commanders knowing torpedo attacks would likely prove futile but feeling compelled to try anyway. On the night of November 13, 1942, PT boats participated in one of the war's most chaotic naval battles. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal saw American and Japanese surface forces clashing at point-blank range in Iron Bedham Sound. 8 PT boats, including Reed SBT Satu Nolsimbilan, found themselves in the middle of a battleship and cruiser slip. Reed later described the scene as something from Dante's Inferno: ships exploding, tracers crisscrossing the sky, water lit by burning vessels and star shells. His boat fired all 4 torpedoes at targets of opportunity. He never knew if any hit, and suspected none did. The battle's confusion made accurate damage assessment impossible, and post-war Japanese records showed no torpedo damage to major vessels during that engagement. The psychological toll on PT crews became increasingly evident. Ensign John Searles, assigned to PT-59, wrote home about the growing despair. He described the sick feeling when ordered to make torpedo runs, knowing the odds of success approached zero. His boat had fired 16 torpedoes in combat, 16 failures. Searles wrote of watching torpedoes pass directly under enemy ships without exploding, or strike hulls with audible clangs only to sink inert. He questioned whether he and his crew were cowards for feeling relieved when torpedo attacks failed, sparing them the extended gun duels that followed when they pressed attacks home. The Bureau of Ordnance finally authorized field modifications in December 1942. PT boat tenders at Tulagi began deactivating the troublesome magnetic exploders and relying solely on contact detonators. Engineers adjusted depth settings to compensate for the torpedo's tendency to run deeper than intended. These fixes helped, but they could not cure the weapon's fundamental design flaws. The contact exploder's fragility remained, and torpedoes continued to run erratic. Improvements were marginal at best, raising the success rate from abysmal to merely terrible. Commander Montgomery calculated that PT boats were now achieving roughly a 5% hit rate, 1 functioning hit for every 20 torpedoes fired. By naval standards, this was catastrophic. Japanese commanders noted the slight improvement, but their fundamental contempt remained unchanged. Captain Tamachihara, commanding the destroyer ship Gear, wrote in his memoirs about PT attacks during this period and described them as nuisance raids that rarely threatened a properly handled warship. His destroyer had been attacked by PT boats on 4 occasions, and not once had a torpedo come close to hitting. His greatest concern during those attacks was not the torpedoes, but the possibility of a collision in the dark, an embarrassing way to be damaged. January 23, 1943, brought bitter weather and tropical storms to the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Commander John Bulkeley, the celebrated PT boat officer who had helped evacuate General Douglas MacArthur, returned to the Pacific to inspect operations. What he found shocked him. The boats he had championed were being wasted on missions they could not accomplish, commanded by demoralized officers and maintained by crews who had lost faith in their weapons. Bulkeley's report to Admiral William Halsey left no doubt. The PT boat program was failing, and men were dying for nothing. Casualty statistics told a grim story that propaganda had obscured. By early 1943, PT squadrons in the South Pacific had suffered over 40% casualties killed, wounded, or missing, with virtually nothing to show in confirmed sink. Individual losses underscored the cost. PT-112 had been blown apart by destroyer gunfire after a failed torpedo attack, killing all 12 crewmen. PT-44 struck a reef while retreating from a Japanese cruiser. Her crew were captured and later executed. PT-37 had been cut in half by a destroyer during a daylight encounter forced by pursuit after another botched night attack. Survivors could count on one hand the confirmed enemy vessels sunk by torpedoes. Japanese records, meticulous in every engagement, revealed the full scope. Through February 1943, American PT boats had fired roughly 450 torpedoes in the Solomon campaign. Japanese damage reports documented 7 confirmed hits that caused significant damage. 7 hits from 450 torpedoes yielded a hit rate of about 1.6%. By contrast, naval artillery of the era achieved hit rates of 20 to 30% under similar conditions. The PT boat's primary weapon was effectively useless. One mission that captured the period's frustration involved Lieutenant Hank Bradingham commanding PT-159. Intelligence had identified a Japanese convoy moving through Kula Gulf. 3. Transports escorted by 2 destroyers. Bradingham led a division of 4 PT boats in a coordinated attack on the night of February 11, 1943. The boats approached from different angles, achieved surprise, and launched 16 torpedoes at ranges between 600 and 1,000 yards. These were textbook attacks executed under near-ideal conditions. The results devastated American morale. 3 torpedoes exploded prematurely, 2 porpoised and broached, 4 ran beneath their targets without detonating, and 7 simply disappeared. 0 hits, 0 damage. The destroyers counterattacked, sinking PT-163 and damaging Bradingham's boat so badly it barely made it back to base. The Navy's response to mounting criticism was to double down on training and tactics, as if the problem lay with men rather than machines. Additional PT squadrons deployed to the Pacific and received intensive night attack training. Doctrine manuals were revised, inspiring speeches were given. But none of this addressed the root cause. The torpedoes didn't work. Lieutenant Commander Montgomery, thoroughly disillusioned, began advocating converting PT boats into pure gunboats, arguing that their torpedo capability encouraged suicidal attacks that killed crews without accomplishing anything meaningful. By March 1943, the torpedo count had exceeded 600 and Japanese officers openly mocked American PT boats in their communications. Admiral Kurita issued a directive that PT boats should be considered primarily reconnaissance threats and targets of opportunity, not serious combat vessels demanding major tactical consideration. For the Japanese, this was damning. Despite their speed and aggression, PT boats posed negligible danger to properly defended warships. The much-vaunted cavalry of the seas had become a joke in the enemy fleet. On August 2, 1943, an incident unrelated to torpedo effectiveness etched itself into history. Lieutenant Junior Grade John F. Kennedy, commanding PT-109, was patrolling Blackett Strait with 12 crew when the Japanese destroyer Amagiri appeared out of the darkness. What followed would be debated for decades and later shaped by politics. But the basic facts were deeply embarrassing for the PT program. The Amagiri, making roughly 30 knots, struck PT-109 amidships, nearly cutting the plywood boat in half. 2 crewmen were killed instantly. Fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. Kennedy and the 10 survivors were left in the water, surrounded by burning gasoline. The Amagiri, with only minor hull damage, continued on her mission without stopping. Kennedy's subsequent ordeal, towing a badly burned crewman to an island and eventually finding rescue, became international news and made him a hero. From a tactical standpoint, however, the episode was a failure. PT-109 had fired no torpedoes and had been destroyed without engaging the enemy. An approaching destroyer had not been detected in waters the PT boat was patrolling. The Japanese saw the collision as unremarkable, another example of PT boats' operational inadequacy, while the Americans celebrated Kennedy's heroism and omitted the embarrassing operational context from public accounts. By August 1943, the torpedo count had surpassed 700 torpedoes fired in combat by PT boats in the Solomons. Campaign produced only single-digit, confirmed sink. Japanese naval records documented fewer than a dozen incidents where PT torpedoes caused even moderate damage to warships or transports. The laugh that began with Commander Kurita in August 1942 had spread through the Japanese fleet. From their perspective, American industrial capacity had mass-produced a weapon system that simply didn't work. September 15, 1943. Marked a turning point when Admiral Halsey convened a conference at Noumea to address the PT boat problem directly. The meeting included PT squadron commanders, ordnance experts, and operational analysts who had studied every torpedo attack since the campaign's start. The atmosphere was tense. Junior officers feared retribution for speaking honestly, while senior officers feared career damage from association with one of the war's most visible disasters. Halsey, to his credit, demanded truth, regardless of consequences. Commander Montgomery presented the statistical analysis his staff had compiled. Asterisk, the statistics presented at the conference were devastating. PT boats had fired 743 torpedoes in combat, with only 18 confirmed hits that caused significant damage, a success rate of 2.4%. Of those 18 hits, only 6 had resulted in ship sinking. This meant that, on average, 124 torpedoes were fired for every confirmed sinking. By comparison, American submarines using the same flawed Mark 13 torpedo family achieved roughly 1 sinking for every 15 torpedoes fired. Even considering submarines had larger torpedo capacities and better firing conditions, the disparity suggested that either PT boat tactics were fundamentally flawed or their smaller torpedo variant suffered from additional design problems. Lieutenant Reed, now a lieutenant commander, after surviving a year of combat, gave a blunt assessment from the front lines. He argued that PT boat doctrine developed during peacetime exercises against cooperative targets had proven useless in real combat. The boats were too noisy to achieve surprise, their wooden hulls too fragile under fire, and their limited size meant they carried too few torpedoes to compensate for their unreliability. He noted that effective torpedo attacks required closing to within 800 yards of enemy ships, a suicidal range where destroyer guns could easily destroy a PT boat. Captured Japanese after-action reports presented during the conference confirmed Reed's observations. They described PT boats as irritating but largely harmless. Japanese commanders acknowledged that PT boats occasionally disrupted operations through persistence, but rarely caused serious damage. A report from Vice Admiral Kusaka's staff stated that PT boat attacks had become predictable, with standard defensive tactics searchlights, suppressive fire, and aggressive maneuvering almost always neutralizing them. It concluded that PT boats were useful mainly for reconnaissance and harassment, not for attacking warships or convoys. Representatives from the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport tried to defend the Mark 13 torpedo, claiming that modifications had solved the worst defects and that test data showed improved reliability. They blamed rough seas, poor maintenance, and operator error for combat failures. Their explanations infuriated the submarine officers present. Submariners had used the same torpedo family with far better results, proving the issue lay with either the PT boat version or its tactics, not the crews. Admiral Halsey based his decision on the data and the undeniable truth. PT boats would remain in service, but their mission would change. Torpedo attacks would no longer be their primary focus. Instead, they would shift to anti-barge missions, coastal patrols, and support for ground operations roles that made better use of their speed and guns rather than their defective torpedoes. This was not a retreat but a necessary acknowledgement that continuing suicidal torpedo missions with faulty weapons was reckless. The Japanese quickly noticed the change, as PT boat torpedo attacks dropped sharply in late 1943. Japanese naval intelligence initially thought the Americans had withdrawn the boats from combat, when reports confirmed they were still active but no longer using torpedoes. Admiral Kusaka's staff concluded that the Americans had finally realized what Japan had known since 1942. PT boat torpedoes were effectively useless. On January 8, 1944, the first modified PT boats entered combat. These upgrades reflected hard lessons learned. The new boats carried extra 40mm guns, rocket launchers, and sometimes 37mm automatic cannons, salvaged from Army anti-aircraft units. Torpedo tubes remained, but only as secondary weapons. PT boats had evolved into fast attack gunboats, and in this role, they finally became effective. Barge hunting missions exploited their real strengths. Japanese supply lines in New Guinea and the Solomons relied on armored landing barges that traveled by night through shallow waters. These vessels were slow, vulnerable, and crucial to Japan's logistics. PT boats could now attack them effectively with guns and rockets, without relying on defective torpedoes. Lieutenant John Duke Coley's attack on February 3, 1944, demonstrated this transformation. Leading for PT boats off New Britain, he intercepted 7 Japanese barges and launched a coordinated gun attack. Within 15 minutes, all 7 barges were burning or sinking. The PT boats suffered only minor damage and no casualties. For the crews, it was vindication after years of futility. Morale soared. Ensign Robert Ballantyne wrote home describing the stark difference. Torpedo attacks had been long, terrifying, and frustrating. Barge attacks were immediate, visible, and rewarding. For the first time, PT boat crews saw their weapons working. Even Japanese officers began to respect their effectiveness. Commander Hara, who had once dismissed PT boat attacks, admitted in his memoirs that gun-armed PT boats had become a serious threat to Japanese barge convoys. By mid-1944, PT boats were destroying more Japanese vessels each month than they had during the entire previous year of torpedo operations, and with far fewer losses. Some new PT boat designs even removed torpedo tubes entirely to make room for additional guns. The cavalry of the seas had reinvented itself as a fleet of agile guns. In total, PT boats fired about 800 torpedoes during the South Pacific campaign. Fewer than 30 caused significant damage, and only about a dozen ships were sunk, a disastrous record by any standard. Yet the PT force survived by adapting, turning catastrophic failure into tactical success. By mid-1944, during MacArthur's island-hopping campaign, PT boats supported amphibious assaults in the Philippines as heavily armed guns. Their torpedo tubes were often removed to make room for more guns, and they provided close fire support against suicide boats and shore targets. The broader lessons from the torpedo disaster reshaped the U.S. Navy. The Bureau of Ordnance underwent sweeping reform after investigations, exposed how bureaucratic arrogance and the suppression of field reports had perpetuated the Mark 13 fiasco. Admiral King dismissed several senior officers responsible for the program. New leadership introduced strict testing standards and established channels for combat feedback to reach weapon designers without fear of reprisal. Captain Montgomery, promoted and reassigned to Washington, authored a classified report dissecting how the torpedo failure had stemmed from institutional, not just technical, breakdowns. He cited insufficient testing, dismissal of negative data, blind faith and peacetime assumptions, and a refusal to admit mistakes until the evidence was overwhelming. His report became required reading at the Naval War College, serving as a lasting warning against complacency. Interrogations of Japanese naval officers after the war confirmed their views of the PT boats. Admiral Kusaka stated that Japan had been baffled by the Americans' persistence in using weapons that so clearly failed. He believed that had PT boat torpedoes worked reliably, Japan's Tokyo Express supply runs might have suffered devastating losses, potentially altering the Guadalcanal campaign. Vice Admiral Teo Kurita, who had once laughed at early PT failures, admitted that Japanese commanders often ignored defensive procedures in 1942 and 1943 simply because they did not consider PT boats a real threat of perception. The torpedo failures tragically justified when PT boats shifted from torpedo attacks to gun-based strikes against supply vessels. Japanese commanders were forced to revise their tactical assessments. The small, fast boats, once dismissed as harmless nuisances, had become serious threats demanding real defensive measures. The financial toll of the torpedo debacle was immense. Each Mark 13 torpedo cost about $10,000 in 1943, roughly $200,000 today. With 800 torpedoes fired, the direct weapon cost alone reached $8 million, not counting the expense of the failed missions, the replacement of lost boats, or the human cost of casualties and damaged morale. For a weapon system that sank perhaps a dozen enemy ships, the cost-benefit ratio was disastrous. The human toll was worse. Around 200 American sailors died in PT boat operations during the period when torpedo attacks were still their main mission. Not all of these deaths resulted directly from torpedo malfunctions, but the failures extended combat exposure and increased vulnerability. Every time a torpedo failed, crews had to make repeated attack runs under enemy fire. Survivors later described the sickening helplessness of watching their weapons malfunction as enemy guns closed in. On March 27, 1945, Admiral Kurita, by then commanding what remained of Japan's naval forces, wrote an assessment of American naval capabilities that was later captured after Japan's surrender. His reflections, declassified decades later, offered a sobering conclusion. He admitted that the American torpedo failures had been both a Japanese advantage and an American tragedy. Had the torpedoes worked properly during 1942 and 1943, Japanese losses in destroyers and transports during the Guadalcanal and New Guinea campaigns would have been far greater. The Tokyo Express, which had supplied Japanese garrisons with little concern for PT attacks, could have been devastated. Kurita acknowledged that a single PT boat equipped with reliable torpedoes could have posed a serious threat even to capital ships, fast, maneuverable, and difficult to counter. He agreed with American conclusions that the PT boat's eventual conversion into gunboats had been the only rational move, even though it represented a tacit admission of the torpedo program's failure. He further observed that once the boats began attacking Japanese barges with guns, supply operations became far more difficult. With hindsight, he wrote that if the Americans had used such gunboat tactics from the start, Japan's positions in the Solomons and New Guinea might have collapsed months earlier. Post-war analyses of PT boat performance were grim. Across the Pacific, they fired roughly 1,200 torpedoes in combat, yet confirmed kills numbered fewer than 30 vessels, and many of those claims were uncertain. The South Pacific campaign alone accounted for more than half the torpedoes fired and the majority of the failures. Lieutenant Commander Reed, who survived the war and became a naval historian, later published a landmark study in 1968 detailing the bureaucratic and engineering failures that caused the disaster. He revealed that the Bureau of Ordnance had ignored repeated field reports of torpedo defects and dismissed complaints from commanders as operator error. He also documented how American engineers refused to incorporate proven foreign designs out of pride, and how the Mark 13's critical flaws were known before the war but left uncorrected due to production pressures. Reed's interviews with PT boat veterans captured the emotional toll. Crews joked darkly about baptizing torpedoes because they seemed only to get wet, never to hit. They remembered their rage, watching torpedoes veer off or sink harmlessly as enemy ships escaped. Some admitted they eventually preferred failed attacks to successful ones, since success would have meant enduring longer exposure to enemy fire. Japanese officers later reflected on the episode as a warning about technological arrogance. Their wartime writings shifted from mockery to sympathy, acknowledging that all professional sailors understood the despair of being failed by their weapons. The PT boat torpedo fiasco ultimately became a catalyst for reform. It forced the U.S. Navy to overhaul how it designed, tested, and approved new weapon systems. The Mark 13, once a symbol of failure, became a textbook case in naval education on the dangers of bureaucratic denial. The Bureau of Ordnance was reorganized, its leadership replaced, and new systems established to ensure that frontline feedback reached designers directly. These reforms also influenced how future weapons were tested and deployed, helping prevent similar disasters. John F. Kennedy's later fame drew renewed public interest in PT boats. Though he rarely discussed the tactical circumstances of PT-109's loss, he focused on the rescue of his crew, not on the fact that his boat had been destroyed without firing a torpedo. Like many veterans, he recognized the heroism of the men and the failure of the machines as two separate truths.